Okay, let's unpack this for you. Today, you're diving into a really complex but incredibly important question.
Mhm.
What happens when the ideas of modern democracy and, deep-seated religious plurality meet,
Yeah.
especially outside the places where modern democracy sort of first emerged?
It's a fundamental challenge, isn't it? Because these societies, they aren't blank slates. They have millennia of their own history, their own ways of managing difference.
Right.
And those ways interact sometimes beautifully, sometimes, well, quite contentiously with democratic processes.
Absolutely. And for this deep dive, you've brought a fantastic set of sources, chapters, I think, from a book,
That's right.
zeroing in on this exact relationship in three really distinct places: India, Pakistan, and Turkey.
Yes.
And we're pulling from, what, historical analysis, legal stuff, political science. You've got quite the stack here.
We do. The sources guide you through, well, everything from the legacies of these huge historical empires, Ottoman, Safavid, Mughal, right up to the nitty-gritty of legal frameworks, the ideas of key political thinkers, the figures who really shaped the modern states you see today.
So our mission here, for you, listener, is to really get into the different ways these societies have tried to navigate that core tension: religious diversity versus state power.
Exactly. Comparing their unique historical paths, the specific challenges they've faced, and how they handle that democratic tightrope walk, majority rule versus minority rights.
It's about understanding the distinct itineraries, I think the sources call them.
That's the word they use, yeah. The different journeys these nations have taken.
Okay, let's start at the beginning then. The transition from those massive, diverse empires to the modern nation state. How did that set the stage?
Oh, that shift is absolutely crucial. I mean, think about the Ottoman Empire. It had this long tradition, centuries, of state-managed diversity, the famous millet system.
Right, the millets.
Which gave different religious communities quite a bit of autonomy under their own leaders. Now, the sources are careful here. They point out this accommodation, this toleration.
Often came from a really practical political need. How do you govern these huge, diverse areas after conquest? It wasn't always some deep philosophical commitment. Sometimes it was just pragmatism.
Tolerance born out of necessity, kind of.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Now, contrast that with the Turkish Republic that came later. Totally different ideal. Formally secular, yes, but crucially aiming for ethnic homogeneity, Turkification.
Right.
And that meant actively repressing groups like Alevi and Kurdish Muslims, marginalizing non-Muslims who used to have that millet autonomy, that older, maybe pragmatic way of handling diversity. It was consciously pushed aside for a single national identity.
That's a huge shift. What about India and Pakistan? They share that more recent imperial past under the British.
Yeah, and that shared history under British India, leading up to the trauma of partition, it's absolutely fundamental to their different paths. The sources really highlight how this common past was then interpreted in, well, radically opposed ways by the political elites building the new states.
Same history, but totally different blueprints.
Exactly. And you also mentioned, going further back, Safavid Iran, Mughal India. How did they handle religious difference?
You see similar complexities there, too. The Safavids, for instance, promoted Twelver Shi'ism, sure, but they also sometimes persecuted other groups, like the Nukavi Sufis. And again, the sources stress this persecution even forced conversions, often driven by real politics, reasons of state, as they put it.
There it is again, reasons of state.
It keeps coming up. It seems central to how empires manage these things. Now, flip to the Mughals, especially under Emperor Akbar. His policy of Salikul, universal reconciliation, he got rid of discriminatory taxes like the jizya. And the sources suggest, yeah, there were intellectual ideas involved, but it was also driven by the exigencies of ruling over a religiously diverse empire. Practical needs again.
So these empires, they had their ways, often pragmatic, for dealing with diversity. But the sources make this really interesting point that moving to modern nation states can actually make those older resources less accessible.
Yes, this is a key takeaway. The modern nation-state model, with its strong push towards a single national identity, homogeneity, it often struggles to integrate or even remember those older, maybe more fluid, imperial ways of managing difference.
So the tools for building a nation can kind of overwrite the experience of governing diverse peoples.
That's a good way to put it. It definitely challenges the simple idea that modernity automatically equals more tolerance.
It really does.
Yeah.
Which brings us to, well, how these different states actually thought about the idea of a nation and pluralism when they were founded. You mentioned a crucial distinction the sources make.
Yes, vital for you to grasp this. It's about different types of majorities.
Okay.
They distinguish between episodic or decisional majorities, temporary groups,
Right.
voting on a specific issue.
Right, like in an election.
Exactly. Versus identity-based majorities, fixed social groups, like religious communities. And here's the critical bit. Falling into a minority based on identity, like your religion, can mean systematic exclusion. Not just losing a vote, but being pushed outside full citizenship political power.
And once that language, that idea of fixed identity majorities, gets into politics.
The sources are pretty blunt. They say its effects have proven irreversible. It fundamentally changes the terms of belonging. Permanently.
Wow. And this played out differently as Turkey, Pakistan, and India formed. How do the sources lay out those contrasts?
3 really distinct paths emerge. Turkey went for a model often compared to France, laissez-faire. Formally secular, aiming for ethnic and cultural homogeneity, even if it meant sort of pretending diversity wasn't there.
Right.
Pakistan also formally adopted a singular nation idea, really stressing Muslim identity, pushing other kinds of diversity into the background.
Okay, and India, you mentioned, took another road.
A fundamentally different one, according to these sources. Its constitution was explicitly based on a diverse group of peoples. Religion, caste, language, all these markers were acknowledged from the start.
An internally plural community.
Yes, these sources even say applying the label nation-state to India is far more implausibly than for Pakistan or Turkey. It suggests that label just doesn't capture India's complex reality as well.
That contrast, singular versus internally plural, is huge. And you've got emphasize from major thinkers wrestling with these ideas back then. Let's start with Gandhi.
Gandhi's view was, deeply rooted in India. He saw religious diversity not as some problem to be solved, but as a long-standing and largely untroubling fact, just normal.
Part of the warp and weft of an ancient land, I think was the phrase.
That's it. He insisted Hindus, Muslims, Parsis, Christians were all fellow countrymen. Conflict. It was like brothers quarreling, something you could persuade people out of, not necessarily destined for violence. And interestingly, he didn't think order needed this massive state like Hobbes argued in the West. He saw order coming from social practices, diffused through society. He really felt that demanding one nationality and one religion was just living in a dreamland.
That feels so different from the homogenizing trend you talked about. How did Iqbal compare?
Iqbal was more critical of Indian nationalism as it was developing. He felt it was too influenced by European ideas, interest-based politics. He wanted to recover the ideal or spiritual element, the invisible points of contact between Hindus and Muslims.
Invisible points, contracted with the visible conflicts over property, like mosques or cows.
Exactly. He was looking for something deeper than those material disputes.
And then Maududi had an even more radical critique.
Oh, yes. Maududi fundamentally rejected nationalism itself. He saw it as a purely European concept, totally contradictory to Islam, which he argued deals with man as man, universally.
So nationalism for him couldn't treat non-members equally.
Precisely. He thought it inevitably led to imperialism. And he also questioned liberal rights, arguing they made minorities dependent on the goodwill of the majority. A concern that, still resonates today.
And then from a completely different angle, Savarkar and the Hindu nationalist view.
Savarkar, as the sources present him, tied the nation directly to territory, who belongs, those for whom the land is their holy land. His key distinction between Hindus and Muslims wasn't really religious or spiritual.
Yeah.
No, it was about whether they could be integrated, assimilated, or dissolved within the framework of a modern Indian state. And the sources note how later, practical politics, electoral compulsions, led to pushing to count Dalits as Hindu, to build that necessary majority.
It really shows how those European ideas of nationalism, linking nationhood and homogeneity, got picked up by anti-colonial movements. And then these new nations had to figure out, okay, what does this mean for our actual existing diversity?
Exactly. The sources mention Locke's idea of toleration, for example. It often assumed a basic homogeneity was the ideal, only tolerating limited difference. That set a tough precedent for societies that were already deeply plural.
Okay, this is where it gets really concrete. We've seen the history, the ideas. How did this all play out in actual state policies, legal fights, and what the sources call majoritarian domination?
Right, this is where you see the impact. The sources introduce majoritarian domination as a specific way to understand what happens when an identity-based majority takes control within a democracy. It's not quite the same as just authoritarianism or populism. It has three key features you should really pay attention to.
Okay, what are they?
First, it's discursive. This is about the language, the narrative, conflating winning an election, a temporary majority, with being the permanent, real nation, often based on religion.
So it undermines pluralism by making minorities seem inherently outside.
Exactly. Second, it's epistemic. This involves attacking the diversity of opinion, going after independent media, for instance, trying to create pluralistic ignorance.
Pluralistic ignorance. Meaning?
Making it hard for people to know if others disagree or how much opposition there really is. It bolsters the idea that the majority view is unchallenged or permanent.
Got it. And the third aspect?
Institutional. This is where the executive branch acts to disable or capture other institutions. The legislature, the courts, election bodies, eroding those checks and balances that protect minorities and dissent.
And the sources describe phases to this.
Yeah, often starting with creating that identity script, then winning elections, and then increasingly framing any challenges as disloyalty, sometimes using state power or even violence against opponents.
Okay, let's look at Turkey through this lens, based on the sources.
Well, Turkey has formal secularity, it's in the constitution, but it exists alongside what the sources call a de facto establishment of Sunni Islam, managed largely through the Diyanet, the Directorate of Religious Affairs, big state body.
Right.
A key example they give is compulsory religious classes in schools, based on Sunni doctrine. This is seen as marginalizing or trying to assimilate groups like the Alevis.
And the European Court ruled on this.
Yes, the European Court of Human Rights found it lacked objectivity and pluralism. But the sources note that actually implementing that ruling by Turkish authorities has been inconsistent.
And the Kurdish issue is another major flashpoint.
Absolutely. Historically, the state tried hard to control or suppress the Kurdish language. But the sources really highlight the pushback. How Kurdish activists politicized language use, how mayors in Kurdish areas deliberately increased its public visibility.
Even facing legal challenges, removals from office.
Exactly, like the mayor of Diyarbakir. Despite all that and bureaucratic hurdles, the sources argue this activism has been gradually eroding state power on the ground. Persistent resistance.
And under the current government, the sources note a change.
Yeah, a much stronger intertwining of nationalism and Sunni Islam. And this populist narrative framing religious people as victims of a past secular elite, it makes mutual recognition much harder.
But cooperation still happens sometimes.
Yes, the sources are careful to note that. Like during the Gezi protests, you saw religious groups joining secular ones. Those moments of cross-cleavage cooperation still occur.
Okay, moving over to Pakistan. The sources mention its religious freedom laws started similar to India's. How did they change?
This is a really stark example, especially concerning the Ahmadiyya community. Through political maneuvering, intense pressure, violent protests from right-wing groups, the state officially declared Ahmadis not Muslims.
In General Zia-ul-Haq's time cemented that.
Yes, his government brought in more legal restrictions, even banning Ahmadis from using words or practices considered Muslim, using masjid for their worship places, performing the azan call to prayer. These were framed as encroachments.
But the sources argue why this happened is crucial. It wasn't just religious parties.
No, that's the key argument. It was driven by this broad-based and remarkably enduring political sense among the elite, a sense that appeasing right-wing vigilantes by restricting Ahmadi rights might stop riots.
So religious freedom sacrificed for public order.
Exactly. And public order got redefined to focus on stopping supposed Ahmadi provocations. You even see this reflected in Supreme Court language cited in the sources, calling the Ahmadiyya an attack on Islam, saying violence against them was almost like permitting civil war. It gave strategic value to mobilizing wounded religious feelings. It's a really disturbing insight into state logic.
That interpretation really lays bare the political calculations. And Pakistan also struggles with anti-Shia hostility.
Deeply. The sources talk about anti-Shia sentiment and what they call annihilatory politics, a denial of structural oppression coupled with a strong sense of majoritarian entitlement.
Which is ironic, given Shia involvement in the Pakistan movement itself.
Highly ironic, as the sources point out. They stress the need to challenge that everyday casual sectism that fuels the broader problem.
Okay, let's turn to India. The sources describe its historical approach not just as secular or multicultural, but often as segmented pluralism.
Yes, meaning minority groups had autonomy, but often within a framework that could still be hierarchical. But then, the sources highlight the rise of a majoritarian nationalist approach driven by the Hindu right, and they describe this vision as fundamentally anti-pluralist.
And things like segregation are examples of this.
Residential and job segregation of Muslims, yes. Seen as signs of this ongoing, sometimes hierarchical way pluralism actually works on the ground, even as this new majoritarianism grows.
And they pinpoint a major shift, especially since 2014.
They frame it specifically as majoritarian domination, not just authoritarianism or populism. The argument shifts focus. It's not just the state failing to stop violence against minorities,
but actively precipitating it.
Yes. The sources link this directly to the BJP and affiliated groups like the RSS and VHP, noting increased links, RSS growth, and influence since 2014.
And there are specific examples.
Definitely. They cite politically motivated hate crimes, cow vigilantism, the lynchings, the attacks, and the Love Jihad campaign, this false narrative about Muslim men converting Hindu women via marriage. Crucially, they point to institutional complicity. Local police, administration being involved or looking away, and they note the support these things get from major BJP and NDA government leaders.
What about the Citizenship Amendment Act, the CAA? How does that fit in?
The sources connect the CAA directly to potentially profiling and targeting Muslim citizens. They point out how it offers citizenship paths for immigrants from nearby countries unless they're Muslim. And the documentation required hits poor and marginalized Muslims hardest, linking it to feels about things like a national register of citizens.
And the other parts of majoritarian domination, epistemic, institutional, how do those appear in India, according to the sources?
They describe an epistemic attack on media diversity, trying to shut down dissenting views, amplifying the government line through friendly media, using long-standing scripts of compliant media. Institutionally, they talk about major erosions, stripping Jammu and Kashmir of statehood, executive actions to disable or capture the legislature and judiciary, real challenges to judicial independence.
So it paints a picture of democratic institutions being sort of hollowed out,
Yeah.
used for majoritarian goals.
That's the thrust of the analysis in these sources, but, and this is important, they don't present it as a done deal. They also highlight significant resistance.
Okay. So despite these trends, there's pushback.
Absolutely. The sources see it as India's argumentative democracy still kicking. They list examples. Writers returning awards, scientists protesting, huge student and Dalit protests, the Not in My Name campaigns against anti-Muslim violence, even some court rulings going against government policy.
And the CAA protests were significant.
Very significant. The sources note they were often led by Muslims, especially women, but crucially joined by people from all backgrounds supporting secular, inclusive citizenship. They also mention Muslim leaders like Asaduddin Owaisi arguing for non-discrimination, equal citizenship for individuals, not necessarily group-based multicultural demands.
So the struggle over pluralism within democracy is very much ongoing.
It's dynamic, yeah. Contested, happening right now in all three places, shaped by these deep histories and current politics.
Okay, as we wrap up this deep dive, what are the main takeaways for you about these distinct paths, these itineraries Turkey, Pakistan, India have taken?
You really see how deeply their specific imperial pasts, how their independence happened, the founding choices they made, how all that has steered them down different roads in dealing with religious diversity and state power.
And the common thread seems to be the challenge of moving beyond just having diversity as a social fact.
To actually building a shared, normative, pluralist imaginary. A real commitment to respecting difference within a framework where everyone has equal citizenship. The sources really argue that modern states, modern nationalism, despite claiming secularism or unity, often end up embedding majority preferences or creating new, sometimes harsher, exclusions than the old empires did.
Understanding these different stories offers really crucial lessons, doesn't it, for anyone trying to grasp democracy and diversity today?
Absolutely. These cases highlight how fragile pluralism can be when faced with these homogenizing pressures, how democratic tools themselves can be used for majoritarian ends, and just how complex the interplay is between laws, politics, and social identity on the ground.
It definitely leaves you thinking, given that identity conflict and majoritarianism persist to these quite different places, what does that tell you, the listener, about the universal challenges, trying to build genuinely inclusive societies anywhere?
And maybe thinking about how everyday life, social interactions, political actions, big and small, how they all continue to shape what religious freedom and equality actually mean for people living in these states. It's not just about constitutions. It's a living, breathing, ongoing negotiation.